she always reminded us they are not just business decision makers. They are people. They want to have fun and they want to really connect with a human truth that goes beyond a business decision.
Welcome back to Horizons Podcast, where I convince marketing leaders to spill their secrets for the rest of us. Today, I'm thrilled to be sitting down with Gastón Tourn. Gastón is a poetry-obsessed CMO whose marketing campaigns are powered by literature and code, leading from Google to wonky vegetables with startup stops at dating apps and AI news along the way. Gastón, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nate. Really good to see you after almost a decade that we worked together at Google. So amazing to find, again, time to talk with great colleagues.
It is, and it's incredible what you have accomplished in those 10 years. I want to start with one of your recent LinkedIn posts. You wrote about the importance of finding meaning rather than finding balance. How has this guided your marketing career?
I think meaning is probably one of the things that I have always obsessed about. Since actually university, I have obsessed about meaning. I'm not sure if you know that there is a discipline called semiotics. And semiotics, what it does, it studies how human beings build meaning. Through language, we build a lot of meaning, but also through other things, like, for example, even our nonverbal communication. I am building meaning with my facial expressions. And meaning is such an interesting thing because in the end, I think it's what distinguishes probably us from other species. We give meaning to stuff. Like we give meaning to our life. We give meaning to our relationships. We give meaning to brands. And I think it has a lot to do with our abstract way of processing the world. Like we process information and then we assign a certain kind of attribute to that information that we're getting, right? We work together, but it's not just work together. Like I remember you, Nate, and I have some meanings associated with you, like being someone really smart, really kind. And those meanings build our relationship. And then when, for example, you approach me for this podcast, I remember those associations I had with you. So I think meaning is really important. And I think it's definitely the way that we build relationships, not just with the world, but also with people and with brands. And what is interesting is that usually the things that we remember the most, so the meanings that made most difference in our lives, have a lot to do with contrast. So that's why I think balance is not necessarily the way to build meaning. If I ask you what happened last week, you're not going to tell me the routine. You're not going to tell me those balance moments. You're going to tell me moments that were really, really kind of out of balance. For example, today I asked you, how's everything going before we started the podcast? How's everything going in Singapore and with the office? And you told me about flooding in the office, right? Which is something out of the ordinary, out of the balance. And that's why I think it's so important, especially as marketeers, to think how we can attract attention. And attention always needs to break the balance in order to build meaning.
That's incredible. What have been some of the ways you've broken that tension in some of your campaigns?
So for example, the current one that we're running with Oddbox, so we're currently running a campaign across like different mediums, but especially on the Tube in London. I know that you should live in London. So whenever you launch a campaign in the Tube, it's kind of like that feeling of almost like a baby being delivered because you can see your brand suddenly in real life. But we're also running it on TV in the UK. We're running it across different digital channels. And it's very interesting, maybe just to give some context to people who are listening and hearing about Oddbox for the first time. So I'm currently a Chief Growth Officer at Oddbox. What we do is we rescue fruit and veg that otherwise would go to waste. Around 40% of fruit and veg in the world is wasted just because it doesn't meet the cosmetic standards from supermarkets. So supermarkets want apples that are these, ridiculous size that actually doesn't make any sense for the flavor or for the taste or for like actually the nutritional benefits of that apple. It's just for cosmetic standards. And 40% of fruit and veg is wasted, which contributes in general food waste to around 10% of carbon emissions. So when we think about how we can address climate change, this is one of the most tangible ways of really mitigating climate change. And the brand is called Oddbox because what we offer is really a box of odd fruit and veg. But in order to drive people's attention, our current campaign, and a lot of people in the UK already know the brand. So we have 51% brand awareness in the UK. So a lot of people already know about Oddbox. They hear about Oddbox. But we wanted to flip that expectation. So the whole campaign is around, who are you calling odd? Are we actually the odd ones, or are supermarket the odd ones for basically throwing away fruit and veg that is perfectly edible just because of the look of it? So the whole campaign is based on that concept. And for example, we have an amazing ad that is a beautiful potato that looks really odd. The tagline is not as odd as potatoes in plastic. Because, for example, we don't use any plastic in our boxes. Where supermarkets, yes, they have perfectly looking potatoes. Isn't it weird that we wrap them in plastic? Why do we do that? So that was, for example, one campaign that I'm currently running in the UK, where I try to really flip people's expectations to basically get their attention.
And now a word from our sponsor. It's me. I'm actually not taking any sponsors in season 1, but I just wanted to say thank you for listening. It's been such a joy recording these episodes, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I have. If you would like to support the podcast, the single most impactful thing you can do is leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. This will help new people discover the podcast. And if you have someone in your life who's passionate about marketing, send this their way. They'll probably love diving into these insider tactics and stories. With that, back to the conversation. I've seen some of this ad campaign on your LinkedIn. It is quite stunning. Also, just the visuals that you're putting out there really state that message well. You have a particularly unusual combination of degrees. You studied literature at Oxford, and you recently got your master's in computer science from Harvard. How do these sort of different skill sets come together in the way you approach marketing?
Yes, with my latest degree, I'm still halfway. So I didn't get my master's in computer science yet. I'm still studying for it, but I am kind of like halfway. And I think in my career in general, I try to always learn new things. I think curiosity is a value that I really care about. That's why I had such a great time working in a company like Google, for example, because Google is a company that really values curiosity, or at least during my time there, I felt that curiosity was rewarded as a value. And the product itself, actually, Google Search is a product that is all about curiosity. It's about asking questions, about finding new information. And for me, curiosity has been a constant driver in my life. I have always loved writing, but I have also always loved numbers. And it's a quite like odd combination, because most people who love maths and numbers, they tend to be less interested maybe in language or words. Whereas vice versa, people who are really interested in literature, they tend to not be interested in math. And in my case, I have always been interested in both sides of things. And in the end, actually, I think they're like very much connected. I think both numbers and words, what they do, going back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago, I think they're like abstract representations in our minds of things that are happening in the world. And I have always been fascinated about that. I have always been fascinated about language. And I actually thought like I would study linguistics in university or symbolic systems. I ended up studying communication because it was still very much connected to that. Like, how do we actually communicate and build meaning around the world? But I feel like both creative writing and computer science share way more similarities than you would expect. I think people would say, oh my God, that's like complete opposites. But actually, they share a lot of similarities. And my project at Oxford, I did a master's in creative writing at Oxford. One of my annual projects was writing code poetry. So I wrote poetry using programming languages. So I, for example, wrote a poem about Google using Google's source code. So I took the source code of Google and used it, rearranged it to write a poem about Google. I took the source code of Instagram and wrote a poem about Instagram using its own source code. And that project was really interesting because, first of all, it taught me that a lot that is going on in the internet, we don't really have visibility into it. Like a lot of that is code that we're not seeing. But also it taught me that poetry and code share a lot of similarities. First of all, like how succinct both forms of expressions are. When you write code, it's very succinct, it's very much to the point, and poetry is exactly the same. It's very succinct as a form of expression, but also think the importance of certain words. When you write in programming languages, there are some keywords that are incredibly important. For example, a for loop. like the word for in a loop is really important, or like the if else. And it's the same in poetry. Some words have more weight in poetry. With that project, I became not just obsessed with poetry and with writing, but I also became obsessed with computer science. And as soon as I completed my master's in creative writing, I thought like the next one I have to do is computer science. And I already knew how to program, but quite amateur. I think as most people, like, you know, a bit of HTML, a bit of CSS, but I said like, think, you know, particularly after doing that project, I really need to go really deep into what's going on under the hood of the technologies that I'm marketing. I have always been marketing technology products, but I really never understood what was going on behind like the technology. Computer science really, really helped me with that.
I find that fascinating, though, that you went for this master's in poetry or creative writing, and in writing a poem, you discovered a love for writing code. How have you applied that in your work, or is this like a fully separate thing that is fascinating and pursuing curiosity, but doesn't apply directly to work?
So I never think, is this going to be useful for my job? I always think, what is going to be interesting for my mind? I think that's always my question when it comes to studying anything. In fact, when I did my bachelor's degree, when I chose communication, I remember that my grandparents were like, are you sure you're going to die of hunger with that degree? Like, are you sure? Don't you want to do something more useful? Don't you want to do like law or something more traditional? And I feel like, you know, I'm really interested in language. I'm really interested in communication. I'm not sure where this is going to take me, but my mind tells me that I just want to know more about this. And then in the end, life happens. And, you know, I have used a lot of the skills and a lot of the learnings I took from my undergrad degree in my career. But at that point, I didn't know really how I was going to use it. And then, of course, as soon as I joined Google, I invited my grandparents to the office just to see that I was not dying of hunger. And we had a lot of free food as well. But I think I never thought really, is this going to be useful? When I did my master's in creative writing, it's because I'm fascinated about writing. And in particular, I'm fascinated about creative writing because a lot of writing and a lot of language is about useful communication, right? Like currently we're talking about things that are useful. Creative writing is probably the area of human communication where that sense of a useful purpose becomes a bit more vague. And it's not really about sometimes pure communication of a purpose. It's more about expression of something deeper. And that's why I have always been fascinated about it. But actually then creative writing has been so important for my marketing career. It gave me so many tools. Now when I review a creative, I can immediately say this is not working because of X. Or I can really pinpoint things that before intuitively I thought like this creative is not resonating, but I don't know exactly why. Now I'm like, it's because of this. And this is how we can fix it. So it gave me so many tools. And then similar with computer science, I didn't study computer science because I want to become a programmer. I don't want to move to an engineering team. I just study it because I find computer science fascinating. But then in the end, it really helps me because, for example, now I have a CRM manager on my team. And whenever there are issues with like the code of our emails, I can go and fix it and I can go and advise them. Or whenever the engineering team tells me that's not possible, I'm like, are you sure? Because actually, if we do this, I think it's possible. And then they're like, oh my God, you actually know about code. So I think in the end, advice, although I don't have any career advice because every career is different. And I think like everyone has their own path. But at least what worked for me is just studying what you're really interested in. And then I think life is going to find opportunities to make that knowledge useful.
That's incredible. And this might be in a similar theme. A word that I've come across in your writing that I found fascinating, would love to hear more about from you, is what is astronomy? And how does this come out in your concept of marketing?
Yeah. So talking about actually one concept that when I learned it, I never thought it was going to be useful, but then it has been incredibly useful. I learned about astronomy, which is a concept from a literary school in my undergrad. So I studied communication at the University of Buenos Aires. It's the largest university in Argentina, where I'm from. And the second year of my degree, I had a 1 year annual, and it was like basically a whole year creative writing workshop, which was amazing. And a lot of students complain about it because they were we're studying communication. We should have journalism. We shouldn't have creative writing. And we did have some journalistic writing or also like some kind of like digital writing workshops, but they were later on in the degree. The first one was creative writing. So it was poetry, it was fiction. And some people didn't like it because they thought it was not practical enough. I absolutely loved it. And I thought it was incredible. And in that annual workshop, we were basically learning different literary theories and then applying them to our writing. And one concept that really, really, really stuck with me is a concept from a literary school that is called the Russian formalist. So it's a literary school from like the early 20th century. They are from Russia. And they coined this term that is basically called ostranenie. And what they said at that point, they were trying to understand what is literature? Like, how can we define scientifically what is literature? Like, why certain pieces of writing are called fiction? Like, is it because they're not true? Is it because fiction is the opposite of truth? And their answer was no, it's not about that. What literature does, it kind of makes familiar things strange, and it makes strange things familiar. And that's what ostranenie means. It basically means something like estrangement. Like it makes something strange, but also opposite, it makes really strange things familiar. And you can probably realize that in most stories. For example, quite recently I was watching the latest Netflix series, 100 Years of Solitude. 100 Years of Solitude is an amazing novel from Garcia Marquez. Netflix now did it as a series, which is incredible. I highly recommend watching it. And that series, for example, at a certain point, it starts raining flowers. So out of nowhere, it starts raining flowers. And it's really, really strange. But at the same time, the book makes it look like something that is completely normal. Nobody really almost sees that, something out of the ordinary. And I feel like that's what ostranenie means. Most literature, but I would argue most storytelling, what it does, it kind of makes the unfamiliar familiar, and then vice versa. Like it looks at familiar things in an unfamiliar way. And great advertising does exactly the same. I share, for example, one example from Apple, which I love. It's for like the latest AirPods that they were launching at that time. And what they did, it was basically showing a really busy city that was like incredibly chaotic and noisy. And then when someone basically pressed the AirPods, and they were trying to show noise cancellation as a feature, but when someone basically just pressed the button of noise cancellation, suddenly all the noise, all the people in the city started flying and going up to the sky, and the city became really peaceful. And that's exactly ostranenie in action. What it shows you is something that is very familiar, like a busy city, how the product is completely making that space unfamiliar. And that's why it draws your attention. We are drawn to stories because they show us our everyday life in a different lens, or vice versa. It brings a complete unfamiliar view in a very ordinary way. And I think that's what really keeps us going page to page, minute to minute, whenever we watch a story.
That is incredible. And that video, I'll link it in the show notes, so check it out. It is absolutely spectacular. I watched it from your LinkedIn, and it just really sinks home the power of, in this case, noise canceling headphones. You, when you were at Google, were already working with startups. And I think you were helping startups tell their story at Google's London startup campus. What was that initial experience like as you began to dabble in the startup ecosystem?
Yes, it was a very interesting opportunity. So I think for like the audience's context, we used to work together with Nate in the UK marketing team. So UK marketing, what it was focused on, it was mostly on the top products from Google, marketing them to either advertisers or consumers. But then my last role at Google, I decided to shift into a small team that is called Google for Startups. And what Google for Startups does, it helps startups globally to really succeed. Through different initiatives, there are some spaces that are called campuses, which are basically incubators of growth stage startups. There are also some programs where Googlers mentor startups. In my case, I was focusing on two things. One is marketing Google for Startups to different entrepreneurs to make sure that they knew about the different resources that we were providing. For example, we had some we call them residencies, where for like a certain period, startups would have lots of training and lots of different sessions with Googlers to help take their startups to the next level. And we wanted to make sure that we got enough applications to those programs. So partially my role was really marketing these initiatives to different startups and founders. But on the other side, there were already lots of startups in our incubators that we call them campuses. And what I did, it was basically advise all these different startups on their marketing strategies. And I think I learned a lot from that experience because doing marketing at Google, I think, gives you lots of really, really good skills. But then suddenly when you have to advise a small organization and you have to rethink some of those strategies, it really takes your marketing expertise to a very different type of business. I think at Google, like you can always rely on budget or you can always rely on your awareness because Google as a brand has already quite high awareness to launch new initiatives. But then suddenly you have to think, hey, this brand has literally zero awareness. Like nobody knows about it, which is 99% like of the time when it comes to startups, nobody knows about your brand. So the type of strategies that you have to apply when it comes to really helping startups is very different to Google. I do think like my time in corporate gave me lots of amazing skills and I think a lot of like experiences that I could transfer to startups, but it was definitely a learning curve. But it was amazing to see how some of those strategies and some of that advice help entrepreneurs to really achieve their dreams. Because for a lot of entrepreneurs, their company is not their company. It's definitely their dream. I think helping them from a marketing point of view has been incredibly rewarding.
That is incredible. And it is fascinating how very different it is when you're starting from absolutely nothing. No one knows your company exists. How do you start getting that story out there? What would you say were the themes you noticed across these startup founders? Did they mostly have clear narratives for their startup? Or was there a lot of like, let's form that story more clearly? What were the things they needed to achieve most through their marketing?
I would say in most startups, you notice two common mistakes when it comes to their growth strategies. And I think you probably realize those mistakes as you go. So it's not that I was super clear when I started, but I think I kind of noticed two themes. The first one is not knowing how to get the right balance between the why and the what of your startup. So every startup has a really strong vision, but also every startup does something that is concrete, right? And I think a lot of startups struggle with that balance between the why and the what. Some of them go incredibly high level, right? Some of them are even deceiving on their why, right? Like we know cases like Theranos, which are very kind of like, very, I would say badly, like for bad reasons are very popular because they clearly went into a why that was just completely exaggerated. But I would say every startup usually tends to have a very big ambition, right? Which is changing the world for the better. The problem is that message is a bit too high level and abstract. And then I can see lots of startups putting that message on their homepage, and then their conversion rate is incredibly low. And I'm not surprised because basically, if you are selling fruit and veg, and in my homepage, the message is changing the world, consumers are going to go to that homepage and are going to be like, great, but what do you actually do? So I think getting that balance between, of course, having a strong vision and a strong mission, but at the same time, communicating clearly what you do without being too functional. So I think like other startups go the opposite way. It's just too functional. You can see this usually in B2B or in cloud or in AI. They just go so functional that then it's also really bland and boring. So that's one thing. Just get that balance between the why being super inspirational and the what being a bit more actionable. Get it right, because if not, you're going to be confusing or you're going to be uninspiring. And I think both positions are not great. The other thing that I constantly see startups making mistakes about is how to get new customers. And a lot of them will be, let's start with channels. Let's do some Google. Let's do some Instagram. Let's do Facebook. Should I do LinkedIn? And first, who is your audience? because unless you have clarified who is your audience, all the discussions on channels are completely irrelevant. So if you tell me, for example, as a startup founder, should I be on TikTok? My answer is, who is your audience? And unless you have an answer to that, then do not think about TikTok, because you need to know, am I targeting, for example, customers who are likely to be more Gen Z? If that's the case, then definitely I think TikTok is a great channel. But if you're targeting people who are over 65, it's very unlikely that your core target audience is going to be on TikTok. So you need to think first who you are trying to convince to join your product before you define a media plan for it. So those are like just two common mistakes that I see literally every single startup making. I have made them as well. And I think I learned the hard way that now whenever I have to advise a startup, really define what you're offering in an inspiring way that is still concrete. And then secondly, make sure that you define who you're targeting with that message before you jump into channels.
Which is fascinating to me. The better mousetrap fallacy is so tempting as a person building something to think, oh, if I just build a better mousetrap, everyone will come to me. I don't need to go out and do the work of finding people, explaining why my mousetrap is better. I can just focus on building. But the reality is they don't know that you exist. You need to go to where they are, and you need to explain, why is this mousetrap better, in a clear way. I think it almost feels like I've built this trap, so I'm entitled to customers. And you have to flip that on its head and realize that I'm actually entitled to nothing. Let me explain this product clearly to my customers. They're entitled to understand what they're buying before they actually show interest in my product.
Completely. Yes. And I think it's a mistake, or I think it's, in a way, the arrogance that every founder has, right? I remember that at a certain point, Larry Page said on an interview, and he's an amazing founder. Like, by saying this, I'm not criticizing him. He's an amazing founder. He founded an incredible company. And I can understand where he was coming from with that comment. But at a certain point, I think he mentioned something like, the time I hire a marketing team, I will know that my product is failing. That's what he said. I think probably at the beginnings of Google, because clearly then the marketing team at Google is huge. So he didn't follow through with that statement. And maybe like his words were not exactly that. So maybe I'm paraphrasing. But it was basically that sentiment of, if I hire a marketing team, it kind of like tells me that my product is failing. And I can understand where he was coming from, because there's also a mistake from a lot of founders who think that just with marketing, just with good messaging, you're going to get people to really love your product. And there was a phrase that my grandmother used to say in Spanish. Basically, the phrase is something like, if you put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. And I think it's something, and pigs are beautiful, by the way, but I think like what she was trying to tell me is that you cannot just try to dress up stuff that is not working. You might do the best marketing in the world, but if your app is constantly crashing, if Google search is not giving you the right answers, there is no marketing that is going to make that product successful. So really focus on making sure your product is incredible. And I think when Google launched as well, so sorry, I'm just going to get the light again up. I'm not sure why it constantly goes off.
It gives us a better appreciation of time.
Yes. But yeah, I was saying that also when Google launched, maybe at that point, it was more realistic to just rely on product to build an amazing user base. The same with like ChatGPT. I think like it was the first kind of version of AI that was very easy to access as a consumer. But then after the initial product in that category launches, it's pretty much impossible to just rely on an incredible product to get customers in. You will have to do the work of knowing how to communicate and market your product.
So true. So true. And so that brought you to Bumble/Badoo leading marketing for these dating apps. What was that like going from corporate life to fully into a startup? And how did that show up in your marketing?
So it was definitely a learning curve. And I think I made a lot of mistakes along the way. And I learned a lot about who I am as well through that role. Dating apps are fascinating. I think you learn so much about human behavior. You learn a lot about how people engage with something that is very, very personal, like dating. But at the same time, what is really interesting in a dating app is that you can see that things that you suspect are really personal, actually they're not. They're very cultural. And you can see massive differences culturally across markets in the way that people date that are not definitely you. It's more like the culture that is surrounding you. And I think the expectations we have around dating, even the expectations we have around our own sexuality, have a lot to do with the cultural trends and the cultural norms of the country that we live in. So that, I think, was fascinating from a human behavior point of view. From a marketing perspective, dating is so much fun. I think like the campaigns you can do are incredibly fun. Had a lot of fun just coming up with like taglines, reviewing creatives. So it was fascinating. It was not perhaps the right match for me from a cultural point of view, the company. And I think that's something that I learned. And I think what I learned from that experience is that it's okay to say this is not the right match for me. As much as also it's the same, when it comes to dating, you can say this is not the right match for me. I think it's the same with jobs. I think for me, Badoo Group, which is now Bumble Group, was my first company after Google. And I didn't have many expectations about what companies should do, but clearly my expectations were very high for Google because I think Google has an incredible working culture. And despite all the articles that, are negative sometimes about Google, I think it's an incredible company with really good values, with really good people. And in general, of course, every experience is different, but my experience showed me a certain level of ethics when it comes to professional interactions that was really refreshing to see. But I think like there is differences in every company. And I think in that case, for me, it was not the right match, my next step. But I learned a lot about that experience because what it showed me is that even if you like the product, even if you really think there is a massive business opportunity, you need to work in a company that aligns with your values. And I think like that was a very interesting professional learning that I've had from that experience.
That is incredible and such a good reminder that I think we can often put it on ourselves to say, okay, how can I perform and succeed, whatever that looks like in this role, but to recognize actually I shouldn't succeed in every role. I should find the role that is the right fit for me and succeed in that role. I want to dive deeper though on that first piece you're talking about of how the dating preferences or dating behaviors are sometimes more cultural than they are personal. And I want to broaden that to your time at Emma Sleep. You went from, when you were running marketing at Emma, the mattress company, you went from 7 countries to I think 21 countries in a single year. How did you localize your marketing so rapidly across the world?
It was absolute madness. I'm not going to lie. I think it was so difficult. And it's not just marketing that is very difficult to localize. When it comes to a physical product, it's even localizing physical products as well. The sizes of mattresses differ significantly across every country. Some countries do not even have standard sizes. So in India, for example, which is a country where we launched, people do not want specific sizes when it comes to their mattress. What they do is they usually go, like someone comes to their house, measures their height, and does a custom-made bed and custom-made mattress that is based on their kind of like preference and their height. As you can imagine, you cannot scale up e-commerce business using that model. So it was definitely really interesting and challenging because it was not just about localizing your marketing. It was also about localizing your physical product and your operations in massive countries like India, China, the US, all of them with very different expectations. So what's fascinating, I learned a lot about different countries and different markets. But I think what you realize is that we have a lot of similarities, but also we have a lot of differences globally. And you really need to be aware of that if you want to succeed.
And you in particular are very familiar with a number of different localities. I think you speak something like 8 languages, which gives you a unique perspective when it comes to localization. What do you think are the mistakes companies most often make when they're trying to reach wider markets?
Because I love learning languages. I wouldn't say I'm fluent in like 8 languages, but I have studied 8 languages. My native language is Spanish. I also speak French very fluently and Portuguese and English. I think learning languages opens up new worlds. I think in general, I have always been obsessed about language, as I mentioned. And I think learning new languages gives you new words to express things. I think English, for example, gave me a certain level of brevity and is a very succinct and to the point language. Whereas Spanish is a bit more flowery, and sometimes we have lots of words for expressing feelings that it's hard to use, for example, in English. Like we have different types of love in Spanish. So the word for I love you to a friend is very different to the word that you use to say I love you to your partner, or the word that you would say for I love you to a colleague. So there are very different ways of loving in Spanish, whereas in English it's a bit more succinct. It's more like love is the word, right? But then English has other differences when it comes to expressing other sides of the world. So every new language you learn, I think, gives you just a new perspective on your own feelings and your own expressions of what's going on around you. When it comes to marketing, I think it's very important to be aware that you need to connect with someone on the other end. And I think a lot of companies, what they tend to do is just use a very neutral translation that doesn't connect with anyone. I see this especially, I would say, with American brands when they're trying to launch in other regions. They call it like SPLA, Spanish Latin America. And it's absolutely basically nothing. Like nobody in Latin America connects with SPLA. Like nobody. It's just a mix of Mexican with Argentinian and Colombian. And it just sounds so robotic that you basically know it's not someone on the other end speaking to you. And I think like that's why local brands tend to succeed way more, because they definitely speak the language of that particular country. So the most common mistake I see is trying to be neutral and be bland, and you're never going to stand out by sounding neutral and bland.
Which is fascinating to me because I feel like certain brands, once they become big enough, like let's take Apple as an example, they sometimes have more to lose than they do to win. They launched some ads in the last year that people said, oh, these are quite bad ads, like some of their AI ads, which I also felt were quite terrible. But they had more to lose than they had to win at some point, which almost then makes it natural for them to take a more neutral stance. Do you think that's reasonable, or they should continue to push even if it sometimes has a risk?
I think you need to push in a considerate way. I think whenever big brands make mistakes, I think it's because they tend to be a bit isolated from the rest of the world. And they don't understand that that hype that is within the company is not the hype that is going on outside of the meeting rooms of that company. I think AI is the perfect example. And I feel like multiple big brands got it wrong. I think Apple is one, Google is another one. They also had some ads that were criticized. I think, well, Meta made so many mistakes when it comes to marketing AI. I'm not saying like, I would have done it differently. Like, I'm not saying, my questioning is not like, oh, they did it so bad. I am like so proficient at this. I think like you learn along the way, right? But I think like why probably those mistakes happen, I think it has a lot to do with how some of these big brands operate. I think they become echo chambers where like, I can imagine in a meeting room in Apple, everyone saying, the world is excited about AI. We have to do AI ads. And the reality is that outside of big tech, not everyone is excited about AI. There's a lot of fear about AI. People actually think that AI will take away part of our humanity. People are worried, concerned about losing jobs. There are a lot of concerns and fears. And I think as a big brand, of course, you're going to profit from AI, right? Like Apple is going to make a lot of money out of AI. Google is going to make a lot of money out of AI. They are excited for sure. And I think like rightly so, right? It's a massive business opportunity for these big tech companies, AI, but not everyone feels the same way outside. And I think it's important when you're in a big brand to get out of your beautiful building and just speak to people outside. And you're going to realize that not everyone is on the same page. And I think that's why probably some brands got it wrong. And I'm not sure if I would have done it differently if I were in those rooms, because it's very easy to just end up believing your own hype when you are in a big brand. But it's an active reminder to just get out there and speak to people who think differently from what you're seeing and experiencing.
Yeah, because it's far too easy to market to yourself and to say like, oh, this is what I think. I think AI is very exciting. So let me market to a person who thinks AI is exciting and not recognize there are people who don't feel that way and maybe my target customer. So how do I speak their language? How, when you were doing these things, like let's take Emma for an example, when you were marketing in 21 countries around the world, but you were only based in one place, how did you manage to understand your customers in all those different places?
I think it's about giving a lot of power to the local marketing teams. I think that was a lesson I took from Emma. It's really how important it is to trust local marketeers. And I think sometimes when brands become very big, they try to centralize the marketing function. And I can understand why. I think it brings a lot of efficiencies, right? If you have one campaign across multiple markets, it's very efficient. And also the brand is more consistent. But I think the problem with that approach is that efficiency and growth not always go hand to hand. In fact, I think in general in marketing, you're always balancing efficiency with growth. If you're too efficient, most likely you're compromising growth. If you're growing too fast, most likely you're compromising on efficiency. And I think that was a learning that I will always take. It's particularly when you're like dealing with multiple markets, the temptation is to centralize, to be more efficient, but you're going to lose a lot on being relatable and understanding that market. And giving more power to the local markets, I think is going to make you grow faster in those places. And I think it's something that also I saw and experienced when I was in a big company like Google. There was always tensions and transitions between a central team, an EMEA team, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and the local team. And there's always lots of friction and tension between those different kind of structures. And I think what I experience is that the more local you go, the better it tends to be for business results.
How, when you balance this efficiency and the localization, how would you draw the line? Would you just say, give the budget to each of the country marketing teams and let them run with it? Or would you say, I'm still going to approve and make sure that the Emma brand is represented in each of these campaigns, but you can do everything else? Where exactly would you balance between centralization and localization?
I think you always need to think about the business objective. Is the business pushing for efficiency or is the business pushing for growth? And then with that in mind, I think you can make the right choices. At some points, I think a business is going to really push for efficiency, and a centralized structure might make more sense because you can save on cost from local markets. And then also when you do a campaign, you can roll it out across multiple markets more quickly. But that's going to come at a cost. Nothing in life is free. Like there's nothing that is going to be amazing for everything. And that's, I think, another really good professional learning. I think in general, with our careers, we expect that doing something is going to be good. And then we learn that another thing that we did is actually bad. And I would say there's always two sides to everything. Some strategies are going to work, but they're going to have some drawbacks. There's going to be something that is not great about them. So efficiency, it's great. And a lot of companies now are pushing for efficiency, but it's going to come at the expense of growth. And it's going to come also at the expense of long-term brand reputation. But sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes you do need to push for efficiency. And a centralized structure will probably achieve that way better than a local structure. But if you're pushing for growth, I would say a local structure makes more sense. It's probably going to get you to results much faster because it's people who understand the market, who are seeing local opportunities that central team will never see, and who also speak the language of those customers. So I think like that's in the end, what you need to have in mind is what's the business objective, what's the business strategy, and then align your marketing team structure to it.
I love that way of thinking in trade-offs, that it's never, can I have everything? It's, can I have this or can I have that? And which one do I want? And that I find very helpful in saving time, that then you don't spend forever looking for the perfect solution, but you just recognize, okay, this is good enough to be worth the costs. In this case, I choose efficiency, or in this case, I choose growth. I want to go into your time at Appear Here. So this was a B2B company, and you had written a wonderful quote that B2B doesn't mean boring to boring. How did you approach diving into business-to-business marketing?
Yes, and I feel like actually that quote comes from an amazing leader that I had at Google. I used to report to Nishma. I'm sure if you remember, Nishma. I think she's the one who once mentioned to me that quote, or I feel like she inspired it. If she didn't say it, she inspired it, because with Nishma at Google, I was doing B2B marketing for advertisers, for large advertisers, because I think UNAID were focused on small and medium advertisers.
Exactly. Yeah.
So like on complementary teams, but focus on different kind of clients. And Nishma's approach to B2B marketing was incredible. It was very different to what I experienced in the past. Before, I also worked in other B2B marketing teams, but I think Nishma had this incredible creative energy that, she always reminded us, they are not just business decision makers. They are people. They want to have fun, and they want to really connect with a human truth that goes beyond a business decision. And it's something that always stay with me. She also, I think, once mentioned what people want to do, like what our decision makers, what our target audience wants to do, is they want to get promoted. Like they are working in these big companies. And what we need to basically show them is that advertising on Google will get them promoted. It's going to help their goals, but they're not thinking about our goals. They're thinking about their own goals. And it makes complete sense. I think everyone thinks about themselves first. And that's not being selfish. It's just like a reality, right? Why would I expect the CMO of Samsung to think about Google? Like they will never think about Google. What the CMO of Samsung is thinking is like, how can I make this company profitable? How can I be promoted to the next level, right? And we need to show them how investing in us will help achieve their goals, not our goals. I think those are lessons that I took as well when I started working at Appear Here. Appear Here was already an amazing brand. I think the founder is really, really invested into brand marketing. And he always understood that if we wanted to inspire other brands to launch a shop with us, those brands are usually amazing brands. So they're not going to trust a really boring B2B platform to rent a shop if we don't inspire them, because they are already pretty amazing consumer brands. We had incredible brands launching shops with us. Like we had from all the like cool kind of like sneaker brands and like all those brands that are like StockX, like really trendy, to even really amazing artists. Like we had Harry Styles launching a few new kind of like albums. Like when he launched new albums, he also launched shops in New York and London with us. So they were like pretty amazing clients. And in order to inspire them to launch a shop with us, we had to be inspiring. We could not be a typical bland B2B marketing organization. And I think it's not just for Appear Here or for that category. I would say for every single business category, you do need to think how you can stand out and how you can connect on a human, personal level. Because in the end, as I think Nishma always told me, and I really, really took that learning in my life, you're not talking to business decision makers. You're not talking to buyer personas. You're talking to real people. And I think people have other concerns. People have feelings that go beyond the job they're doing at that moment.
Love building on that, the difference between feature and benefit. In your example, the feature might be ads, but the benefit is they want to get promoted. And knowing the difference between what you're selling, are you trying to sell a feature that no one's going to want to buy, or are you actually selling the benefit that they do want to buy and that they would line up to start buying at your door, is so powerful in marketing.
Completely.
I'm curious, going back to your time or going further into your time at Appear Here, you mentioned this idea of consistency doesn't mean repetition, it means authenticity. How do you apply that across the different campaigns you run?
Yes, that was actually a learning I took from Google as well. And it actually came out of a frustration I had with a piece of feedback that I was given. And I feel like, usually the traditional advice is like, when you get a piece of critical feedback, just take it, never complain. And I didn't complain at the time. I took it, but I knew that I was frustrated about it and I had to deal with it. And I feel like that's another piece of advice or recommendation that I would give to myself, and hopefully it can also work for others, which is feedback doesn't mean that you need to apply directly. Feedback means that you need to consider it. And sometimes when you consider it, you can find a bit more what you really believe in. So going back to that situation, I organized an event, marketing event, and we had different sessions. After the event, I got a piece of critical feedback that told me your messaging is not consistent because in this session, you were talking with these words about Google, and in this other session, you were talking with these other words. And I did see the point, but at the same time, I felt like, honestly, do you think like, we have to repeat ourselves all the time? Like, that's not the way that human communication works. If I meet with my partner and I tell 10,000 times the same stuff, like, he's just going to be like, move on, come on. Like, it's like, we're not parrots, right? Like, as human beings, we don't want to be repeating the same stuff over and over again. And I feel like that's something that a lot of marketeers get wrong, is that consistency doesn't mean repetition. What it means is staying true to your values. So for instance, with Oddbox, my current brand, we are rescuing fruit and veg because we believe that rescuing fruit and veg will minimize the impact that the food industry has on carbon emissions and the impact that it's going to have on climate change. Does that mean that I always talk about rescuing fruit and veg? Do I need to necessarily repeat those three words? No, sometimes I say, well, we go and say the too many and the too odd. Another time I will say we rescue surplus food. So I use different words, but all of them, they go back to the values, which is really about food waste. We are trying to attack food waste. Do I need to repeat the exact same words? No, I'm not a parrot. I don't want to be a parrot. Human beings hate when you use consistently the same repetition of words. So be consistent with your values, but do not be consistent with your words. Use iterations of it, because actually those iterations are going to hone in your message way better than just repeating the same words. And I think that's what I took from that piece of feedback. I do think we were staying true to our values, but that piece of feedback at least helped me really verbalize why I was frustrated with it. Because I think what it taught me is that human communication actually needs diversity and needs a variety of words. What you should stay true, though, is to the meaning of what you're saying.
Yes, hit it from a few different directions, but keep that central core consistent. Just to sidebar from it, because I love what you're saying about not taking all feedback. There's an analogy that stuck with me over the years, which is if I am a castle with no doors and no feedback comes in, that's not going to be great for me. I will lose out on a lot of this positive or helpful feedback. On the other hand, if I have no walls and I'm just a plane, everything is going to come in and my sense of self and the things that matter to me are just going to be run over. But if I'm a castle with doors and I open that door to the appropriate feedback, then that provides the right balance of I can grow from certain feedback, but I can also recognize maybe this isn't the feedback for me to take and not just be overwhelmed by the feedback coming in.
Yes, completely. I consider all feedback. So I don't think like the takeaway from what I mentioned is I do not consider feedback. I think like it's important to consider all feedback. What that means though is not that you should follow feedback blindly. I think feedback is another perspective. Consider it and then think, what is the takeaway from it? Sometimes the takeaway might be, actually, I did something wrong and I need to change my behavior, my approach. But sometimes the takeaway is, actually, I think my point still stands true. I just need to explain it better. So for example, that case, I think the approach was the right one, but I had to explain it better. So I think the feedback was still valid because I didn't explain why I decided to change the wording. Because my belief is that human communication needs diversity in order to really land. Diversity of words, but the same meaning, the same kind of like core of what you're saying. And that piece of feedback was very helpful, not because I follow it, but because it allowed me to put into words, to verbalize something that I knew instinctively.
That is incredible. Okay, I want to fast forward to your current company. There are a couple of other interesting companies in between, but let's come to Oddbox. When you first started tackling marketing for Oddbox, where did you start and how did you approach this problem of, we want to rescue fruit and vegetable, how do we market this to people?
I think the first thing I did is really understanding why people join Oddbox. I think in general, in a startup, one of the most useful data points you have is the post-checkout survey. So when someone checkouts, usually we ask questions after the checkout. And you learn a lot about your customers through that post-checkout survey. So in our case, we ask them beyond the obvious question, which is, how do you hear about us? Which I think is always helpful as a marketeer. We also ask them 2 questions. One is, why did you join Oddbox? And the other one is, do you have any concerns before joining Oddbox? And those 2 questions really help me understand where I should put my attention. How do you hear about us also gives you a lot of insights, but I think like just staying in that level of surface, I think is not going to really help you evolve your messaging and your product proposition. With understanding, for example, concerns, why people might not be necessarily 100% taken by your product, gives you a lot of insight into what you need to focus on. Sometimes when it comes to messaging, sometimes actually it's about revamping your product proposition, because messaging alone is not going to make a difference. And then the same, why people are joining you, you can see how much your messaging resonates, but at the same time, how people care about other things beyond just your core message. So in our case, our core message is around food waste. It's really about rescuing fruit and veg. Very large proportion of our customers join because they want to support local farmers. So they do care as well about supporting local growers, because of course we pay these local growers, and we actually pay a really good, decent amount to like food and bread, basically fruit and veg that otherwise could be at risk of going to waste. So a lot of people join not just because of food waste, but actually because they really care about local growers. And that insight was really, really useful to then think about, where should I focus my communications on? What kind of angles of our product we should highlight a bit more in our marketing communications.
That is incredible. It's interesting, as you were speaking, it reminded me how in sales, there's a whole science around objective handling. How do you overcome these concerns that people may have and help them to be comfortable buying your tool? Whereas in marketing, we aren't talking to them. We don't have the opportunity to handle those objections. But by asking these questions afterwards, you can hear about the objections and then go solve them in your marketing for other people. I want to come to some of your teaching. If I understand correctly, you teach media strategy at your alma mater. What first got you into teaching?
Yes, it's a very interesting new challenge that I approached last year. So I absolutely love learning, and I absolutely love universities. I know that sometimes in the business world, there is a lot of kind of skepticism about higher education. And even more now, I think politically as well, there's a lot of kind of criticism around universities and higher education. But I think they're some of the best institutions that we have built as a species, because they're institutions where everything can be questioned and everything can be asked. It's a very safe space, at least my experience is a very safe space to say things that you're not sure about. And because they're not immediate results that you need to deliver, as it is in a business, you can actually ask very existential questions, which I think lead to really interesting paths. So I have always been connected to my academic background, but I never kind of like taught in my alma mater, which is the University of Buenos Aires, because of course I'm not living in Buenos Aires anymore. But then I learned about this incredible diploma, which is a diploma for graduates, and it's a diploma in digital marketing and advertising. And I connected with the academic coordinator of that diploma, and I just said, like, look, I'm here to help. Like, if I can help with anything, like, I would love to. And he actually reached out and said, like, look, we're looking for like new lecturers for certain modules, so let's connect. And it was amazing, right? Because it was just one message with literally like no expectations. It was more around, if I can help, I would love to help. And then actually that led me to start teaching in that. So I teach a module on media strategy. And basically what I focus on is, how can you go from a marketing objective to defining a media plan that really helps you deliver that objective. But I really love it because I learn a lot from students as much as I learn from also the other people in the program. So you hear a lot of experiences. In the last like module I taught, for example, there were like people who had experience working in UNESCO or like in the United Nations. Also people who had experience working in big agencies or in small brands. And all those experiences contributed to my own knowledge. So I think teaching sometimes what it does, it really shows you a different way of seeing challenges that you have experienced in the past.
What do you observe are the biggest differences, or maybe even things that marketers who are further along can learn from the next generation?
I think one thing I learned from these classes is that everyone has different kind of media habits. And I think it's very easy to just assume that your own media habit is probably the average, but we're living in a world that is more fragmented than ever before. And everyone has incredibly different media habits. So coming up with a media plan that really reflects the media habits of your target audience is becoming incredibly harder, because before it was very easy to group people and be like, well, these are like, the middle class that is professional. Most likely they're watching TV and they're doing X, Y, Z. Nowadays, the professional middle class is just literally watching 10,000 different media channels. In every single platform, there are also differences in terms of what kind of stuff they watch there. So the media landscape is becoming incredibly fragmented, and always reminding yourself that because you're part of the target audience doesn't mean that your media habits are necessarily the media habits of anyone else in that target audience. I think it's a constant reminder, and it's something that I'm always thinking about when it comes to putting together media plans of the brands I work for.
It's fascinating. And it is, I think, less intuitive to me. It makes sense that the thing or the person who is not me, I'm going to have to understand them before I market to them. But the person who's similar to me, I might be more likely to make an assumption about me and think that would apply to them and not realize actually they might be similar in some ways, but they have different habits in other ways. That brings us to the lightning round. Now, what I love to do in this lightning round is I'll just throw out a couple of very short questions. Feel free to give a brief answer or expand on it, up to you. The first question, growth metrics or brand narrative?
So do I have to choose one?
Have to choose one or the other.
I think brand narrative. And I think with a strong brand narrative, growth metrics come.
Fair. Customer interviews or analytics dashboards?
Customer interviews. And even more, I would say just observing customers without interviewing them. I think analytics dashboards give you data points that are basically signals about how people behave. But the closer you can be to how people behave, the better.
Marketing in English or marketing in Spanish?
Marketing in Spanglish, I would say. I never did a lot of marketing in Spanish, actually, which is interesting because I only worked in Argentina for 4 or 5 months before I was transferred to Brazil. So after that, I was working in Brazil for Latin America. So I was doing some campaigns in Spanish, but I was doing a lot of marketing in Portuguese. And then I worked a bit like the US, the UK. So I haven't done a lot of marketing in Spanish, but it's definitely something that I would love to do because it's my native language and I absolutely love Spanish.
It's amazing. Literary theory or computer science for understanding customers?
I think literary theory and literature in general. I think it's one of the most nuanced, I think it's one of the most representations of human behavior. I think computer science is incredible because it automates stuff. Human beings are unpredictable. Human beings are not algorithmic, and we are very nuanced in our behavior. And I think as much as science tries to capture human behavior, there are some new disciplines like, neuroscience that are trying to understand how humans behave. We're always more complex than those theories. And I think actually the only human discourse that was able to capture the complexity of our human behavior so far, I think it's literature.
That brings us to the end of the interview. And before we close, where can people hear more about you and what you're doing today?
So today I am working for Oddbox. And I think, as probably everyone knows at this stage, Oddbox, what it does, we rescue food and veg. And currently we're running a campaign that is all around really flipping around the food system. So currently a lot of supermarkets, I think, as I mentioned, are doing very odd practices like throwing away fruit and veg because they don't look good enough according to their cosmetic standards, or they're not paying farmers fair enough. Our campaign is really about who are you calling odd, because we think odd is a food system that throws away 40% of food just because it doesn't have the cosmetic standards that supermarkets have created. And I would encourage everyone who cares about climate change, anyone who cares about food waste, to join our mission and to really continue thinking about how can they minimize the impact of food waste. Because it's not only morally wrong just throwing away food in a world where there's still a lot of food poverty, but also it has a massive impact on climate change. And climate change is going to affect all of us. So if you do care about not just the future, but the present, we're seeing already currently some of the effects of more extreme weather. I think one of the most concrete actions you can take is on food waste.
That is amazing. Well, thank you for coming on the show. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.